Hello, my name is Matthew Taylor, and welcome to our Bush Broadcast Summer Edition. Now, this webinar is usually reserved for a look back on the year that was and a look to the future. But we couldn't pass up the opportunity to share with you all this wonderful opportunity for Bush Heritage to expand our impact in the Murray Darling Basin. So today we're going to be talking about Nil Desperandum. But first up, I'm joining you today from Gadigal Land in Sydney. They're the traditional custodians of the country I'm on today, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians online with us today. We recognise, of course, that the Australian environment is that we strive to conserve is on land that's never been ceded, and its future well-being is in the hands of all Australians working together. As always, you can use the chat function, please, to introduce yourself. And if you'd like to post any questions during the webinar, we'll get to them at the end in our Q&A section. We've got a lot to cover today, and I've got two wonderful people joining me for this conversation. First up is Joe Axford, our head of region in the north. Hi, Joe. Lovely to see you. Thanks for joining us.
I'm Matthew. Hi, everyone.
And we've also got Bridget Roberts, who's calling in from Nari Station, right next door to Nil Desperandum. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, Matthew. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
So let's crack on. Joe, the first question I wanted to ask you was, could you give us a bit of a background and explain why Nil Desperandum, with this glorious name, is so important, and what's special about the property?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And I'm calling in today from Yarrawarrah and Guyabal country in Toowoomba, where it's beautiful and overcast. I'm really delighted to be talking about Nil Desperandum because it's a very special place on Budjiti country. And it's a beautiful property, quite literally in the back of Burke, but it's not backwards, as that phrase might insinuate. But it is in a really remote part of northwest New South Wales, and it's part of a really important inland freshwater wetland system called the Kuttarabara Basin, which is also known as the Yantabulla Swamp. Nil Desperandum is approximately 4,000 hectares in size, and it's been grazed for over 100 years or so. But importantly, it adjoins now two conservation properties: Bush Heritage's Nari Station Reserve and Yantabulla Station, which is owned by South Endeavour Trust and managed by Bush Heritage. And as Bridget said, she's sitting on Nari today on beautiful Budjiti country. 12 years ago, we purchased Nari Station on the northern Kuttarabara channels to help protect this precious landscape. After purchasing Nari, a few years later, we worked with South Endeavour Trust, and they acquired the neighbouring Yantabulla Station to the southwest of Nari. Bush Heritage now manages these two properties together as one protected area. The purchase of Yantabulla was really important because now we could manage more than double the area, so approximately 30,000 hectares for conservation. The shape of the two properties, though, isn't ideal. It's kind of long and narrow for Yantabulla, and then Nari comes at the top, kind of like a misshaped L. So looking for additional ways to, I guess, better protect this area is why Nil Desperandum was so important, because together with Nari and Yantabulla, Nil Desperandum provides this kind of missing piece of the puzzle to make it a more robust management framework. So, and with the acquisition of Nil Desperandum, together with Nari and Yantabulla Station, we now are able to manage and protect for conservation approximately 35,000 hectares of this important system. Nil Desperandum is situated in the Mulga bioregion and in what Bush Heritage calls the Paru Warrego priority landscape. This is a priority landscape because we're working really hard to reconnect the biological integrity of this system. The landscape's framed by the mighty Paru River and the Warrego rivers that run from Queensland and form part of the Murray Darling Basin. The Paru frames the western edge and is one of the last unregulated river systems in Australia. It's a really beautiful, free-flowing river and incredibly important. Yantabulla Swamp forms a huge inland wetland between the two rivers, and this is an extraordinary area of boom and bust. The landscape has these really long, dry spells where it can appear very harsh, and to an eye that might be used to the kind of green lushness of the East Coast, it can seem really uninviting. But when it rains locally, or when heavy rainfall happens in the north and slowly over weeks and months flows down these two river systems, they fill the creeks and the channels of the Yantabulla swamp. And the whole system is just so incredibly dramatically transformed, and every aspect is humming, busy with life, and a whole suite of wildlife that weren't there before just somehow know that the biota is flowing and it's time to come and feast and breed. And these events are really unpredictable, which makes it even more thrilling, to be honest, when it happens. And this year is a really great example. And I was lucky enough to be there and see some of this and see extraordinary bird life. And it was a reminder to me, certainly when I was there, why it's so important to protect this system. Inland freshwater systems like these are amongst the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet, but unfortunately, they're also in significant decline in Australia and globally. We have polluted them, we have diverted them, we've dramatically altered them and taken much of their flow out for our own purposes, and subsequently, wildlife and production have suffered. And these are some of the most unprotected ecosystems in Australia's National Reserve System, which is why now is really the time to act. And being able to acquire pieces like Nil Desperandum are just of such vital importance, and why Bush Heritage really wants to jump at this opportunity. Protecting inland waters can really improve conservation outcomes. It can also build climate resilience and sustain critical ecosystem services, as well as protect rich biota and wildlife. Thanks, Matthew.
It's a fantastic overview. Thanks, Joe. And it's probably important to add that we've had our eyes on this property for, what, nearly a decade at least, haven't we? It's this piece of the jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? So finally, the owners have been willing to sell, and it's our opportunity to fit that piece of the jigsaw in together, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's a fantastic opportunity, and the previous owners have had a very low stocking rate as well, so the property is in very good condition considering all of those aspects. So it's great to be able to really expand what we're doing there.
Fantastic. And how does this fit, Joe, into our broader 2030 strategy of deepening and doubling our impact? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So a really important part of our 2030 strategy is reconnecting landscapes, and especially between reserves that we already manage and protect. So the purchase of Nil Desperandum really hits our targets for the Paru Warrego landscape, and it increases the land we manage and deepens our impact in the area. The Nil Desperandum runs kind of south of Naree and along Yantabulla Station. So it encompasses now both sides of the Kookaburra Creek and channels, which is the inflow area for the Yantabulla Swamp. So by purchasing Nil Desperandum, we'll increase the resilience and connectivity of this landscape, which is really key to deepening and doubling. And through the ownership and management of both sides of the Kookaburra, the key inflow point for the Yantabulla will be able to really affect the flow. And it's important to always think that when we're thinking about conservation and impact, size and shape and connectivity really do matter when it comes to effective conservation management. So the addition of Nil Desperandum will significantly reduce the edge effects. So how stray stock, feral animals, weeds are all coming into this now protected area state. So our ability to address these threats really will be greatly improved, and we'll be able to manage the area as one and have what I think is true impact.
That's fantastic. Well, listen, Bridget, I'd love to know what it's like living out there, because you live on Naree, don't you? And you've been there for nearly 2 years, is it? And
Yeah, that's
tell
right.
us, can you share with us what's special about it?
I guess as an ecologist, we don't normally live on the reserve, so I'm in a really lucky position that I get to live here. I get to work with my partner, Jack, who's the reserve manager, so it works really well. And it's quite nice to be immersed in the landscape sort of 24/7. You really get to know how things work and all those little quirks that go on. We also have a really great community of people here that are really supportive of us, and they really care about the wetland too. But I think on sort of an ecological level, the best thing I like about living here is just how diverse the landscape is. You know, you can sort of travel only a few hundred meters and you've gone from some floodplain woodlands into a sand hill with just red dry earth and flowers and acacias. And even, you know, you can go back to the same place a different time of day or a different time of year, and it can be totally different. Every time we go out, there's something new that we see, and there's so much still to learn about this landscape because it's really understudied.
I know you've got a special fondness for the herps, as we call them, don't you? The lizards and the frogs, and you're in a pretty good place for that, aren't you?
Yeah, so frogs are sort of one of the most abundant animals across Australia, even in these dry places where you think like, oh God, how would a frog survive here? There's just thousands of them beneath the surface. They're living in these little burrows and cocoons that they've made from their own skin. They're just waiting for the water to appear and just to like make the most of it when they can. So I think we've recorded 17 species of frog on Nari and Yantabula. There's probably a few more to find. And crucifix toads, they're very iconic. They're so beautiful. They just look like little grumpy tennis balls. And they make an amazing sound. And just when there's water laying around, all you hear is just they're calling to each other. And it's sort of nighttime isn't really peaceful and quiet. It's just like this beautiful chorus of frogs. And it's a different frog each night. And it's really special. But yeah, we also have like a lot of different skinks and reptiles and geckos and monitors, and it's just full of life here.
Well, tell us a bit more about some of the other native species that you, as an ecologist, might be expecting to find Nil Desperandum. I imagine it'll be quite similar to what's already known about on Nari and on Yantabula, but there's always the possibility of new things, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. So I guess we've been working in this landscape for over 10 years, so we sort of have a good idea of what to expect. There's a lot of water birds that, you can see on the screen now that we know are going to be there. But just because of how the landscape is quite diverse, and even just this little patch can encompass something totally new that we don't have or protect already on Nari or Yantabula, it's quite exciting. And I think we've only been to Nildo a few times, but we've already found 2 species of plants, silver-leaved ironbarks and pink-fringed myrtle, which we don't have on Nari or Yantabula. So that's quite special to just be expanding our species that we've been protecting. And then, so we are also expecting plenty of ducks, herons, rare birds like Hall's babbler, grey falcon, little eagles we've seen nesting, and then we sort of have like a suite that's not too diverse of little really special mammals. So we get little planigales. They're like a really small native marsupial, and they live in the cracks of the cracking clays, and they're quite flat, and their name literally means flat weasel because they look like a flattened weasel. But they're a little predator, and they're down there and they're hunting around, and we get dunarts. But something I think is really special that we get is, and it's quite rare, it's really small, and it's this little predator called a coulter. They sort of look like a cross between a hopping mouse and a dunart, but they've got these like little tiny sort of kangaroo-like legs. They bounce across there's these like plains, and they hunt, and they're really like quite rare. We don't know a lot about them, but they're really beautiful. They're really special. So there's a lot to find and a lot to see, and yeah, we're always finding new things. It's great.
Well, I imagine it's going to be very exciting if we can achieve our goal of raising the money to buy this property. That you'll be able to go out a lot more and spend a lot more time doing the fauna monitoring as well as the vegetation monitoring out there and seeing what else might come up.
Yeah, definitely. That's very exciting. It's sort of like Christmas every morning when you go to check a trap. Who's there? What are they doing? Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. How wonderful. What a great picture you paint of life out in the bush, which I know is tough at times as well, but it's always lovely to be able to share with supporters some of the wonderful wildlife that we're looking after on reserve.
Definitely.
Well, for the next section, I like to show a video. This is an interview with Ross. He's our Aboriginal Partnerships Officer for the North Region, and he had a chance when he was on country a few weeks ago to actually have a chat about the Budjiti traditional custodians, and we'd like to share that footage now while he takes us through the importance of Budjiti people returning to country.
Well, Ngari, Yantabulla, all this country around here is Budjiti country, so that connection, irrespective of past acts or anything like that, will always add connection to country, but the purchase will actually bring them back to country where they've been dispossessed before and taken to other reserves. You know, they could have went to Wollamaringal or other communities where they was actually taken from country. So now they've got an opportunity where they haven't before to get back to country, where it's very important. It's healing, it's empowering, and you just don't understand it until you've actually got your feet on the ground. That that it really brings, it brings in mixed emotions because they're back to country now and that's that opportunity. But where they can only talk about it. But to get back here and feel it and see it is just an emotion in itself. So it's very important that we make that connection. My role as Aboriginal Partnership Manager of the North is make sure that we all go on that journey together and we put that jigsaw puzzle back together, as to speak, as country and law and outcomes on and what we're going to achieve a really good relationship in building it. So yeah, I think it's very significant knowing that what's on Ngari and knowing that the potential of the heritage on Nildo will draw their storylines and songlines together, because you can't separate land and country when you talk about a cultural landscape. Yeah, well, the water courses are very important to all custodians, because obviously there's neighbouring groups too that would have come here for certain seasons, or traded fish or food, and even marriages. It could have been all certain things, but water is life. So to have water, it's the main source of anything. You can't live without it. So to play an important part of the cultural identity and knowing their country and their boundaries really plays an important part, and watersheds do that. So it's about where you're brought up in the country. It provides, it's a provider, your waterways, and that is a provider of the food, it's a provider of your law, it's a provider of your culture. So they all come into play, so it's very important. And since colonisation, that's been dispersed, but they always talked about that reconnection and knowing their country, but then getting back out here. That's where the importance lies, with the cultural integrity and the cultural spiritual aspects. Obviously we go through a process that we need to get their support, because we don't compete against anything that they might want to own or have in regards to an aspiration or a goal that they do. We try and marry them up in an outcome, or and just work with them, and I think it's an awesome outcome for everyone to to be really involved in and have that empowerment to say that you had something that you have contributed to the outcome of a purchase, where where conservation comes into a very important integral part, especially now that the we've got other challenges in regards to climate change and because I know that there's a lot of changes even in my lifetime I've seen that the breeding seasons are out nearly 3 months. You know, we're pretty well spot on when the gidgee was flowering, when the emus were laying, the porcupines were breeding. They're all out of whack. So we know that there's something happening in this country, and it's working together, combining the both sciences in a way of the conservational science in the Western world and then the Aboriginal science in the cultural world. So they come together as one, and that's how you heal country. That's how you work together for country. You don't work against it. You read country, you work with it, you don't work against it. And that's about the collaboration of getting people back to country, getting custodians back to country, especially the Budjiti people where we built a great relationship with. So, yeah, would make sure that the landscapes are protected and the fruits of it that brings back the natives, and that's why it's really good to have that conservational, environmental, and spiritual and cultural aspect of the landscape to work with. So it's very important that that the landscape is looked at, because we read land, and that's how we relate to it, and Mother Earth. So we don't own the country; we belong to it. So this is where our law starts. This is where our storylines and songlines start. So it's very important that we really connect with the Budjiti custodians in regards of back to country, and especially camps and collaborating with other agencies, schools and that, to get them back, and the younger generation coming through, that transfer of knowledge, the cultural integrity, and they're going to be elders one day, and so they can pass on that knowledge. So it's very important that we come to this place, and just you can feel the presence, the power that it brings to me, and it's not my country, so it's very important that we do bring the Budjiti custodians back, and just continue that great relationship they have with bush heritage.
That was Ross Mitchell. He talking wonderfully about the Budjiti and their relationship to the landscape. And as always, Bush Heritage consults widely before we buy a property, as we are doing at the moment, and involve the traditional custodians in every element of management as we move forward to look after country together. Joe, if we are able to acquire this wonderful piece of land, can you tell us what it looks like when you first have to sort of take over a property that's been managed in a different way, and has had cattle on it? What are the things we have to do immediately, and what's it look like looking ahead for the future plans and opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And Bridget touched on it a bit, because some of this is getting to know the property. Some of the key things that we do first are actually making sure that we have the strongest type of protection over it. Bush Heritage makes a commitment to our supporters and as part of our charter for perpetual protection of areas. So we'll look to New South Wales government and work with them to ensure that we have a covenant and that it's strongly protected as much as we can. But it's also a really exciting time of assessment and discovery. We're so keen, as Bridget was, talking about, to get boots on the ground and really discover what lies within. I was struck a few weeks ago when I was lucky enough to be at Nari with Bridget and her partner Jack, who's the manager. And Bridget, being a reptile lover, very skillfully as she did, just happened upon this most gorgeous legless lizard that was a new species for Nari, and would not come across it before on the property. And it just really reminded me of how much we don't know about these systems. And even after 12 years of recovery of a system, we have new species coming in, and so the possibilities for Nil Desperandum are really endless. And our focus will be on returning country to good health, ensuring it's protected and facilitating Budjiti custodians back onto country, and doing the hard yakka land management tasks of removing internal fences, letting country breathe, cultural heritage assessments, developing a management plan or extending our current management plan to include Nil Desperandum, looking at a fire management plan, conducting those ecological services, and then developing a feral animal and weed strategy, and really rolling up our sleeves and doing the hard work to bring country back to health. I saw in the comments somebody asked about feral pigs and goats. That they are key threats in this area, and ones that we work really hard, as do our neighbours, which is great. We work with the national parks on that, local land services, and our pastoral neighbours to really address some of those key threats. And that will be key to what we're doing in this landscape.
Fantastic, thank you. And that legless lizard is in fact the one that bit Bridget, didn't it? As a sort of thank you for being captured and identified.
Yeah, that's right. And Lizard and Bridget can actually give you the proper name, of course. That's her skill set. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Joe. Well, Bridget, that's a good segue into what's going to have to get managed in terms of the threats to the reserve, and you've mentioned goats and pigs already. And also, what other challenges are there? Can you tell us a bit like what you anticipate and what you and Jack are going to have to be tackling?
Yeah, so like Joe said, I guess there's just so much that we don't know yet. So a big part of it's just going to be being there and seeing how much of an impact things like goats and pigs are having. Goats and pigs are sort of two of our biggest threats, like Joe said, and they're really problematic because not only do they graze native plants and they can change the composition of things in, like the ground layer, which is really important, and native grasses, but they're hooved animals, and we don't have those in Australia as native animals, and our soils are sort of, they're not, I guess, like they're just not used to it. So they can cause a huge amount of damage. They just break the soil down, really contribute to erosion, and on top of that, they just spread disease. So yeah, we're going to be needing to figure out where pigs and goats are problematic, how we can manage them, and what our options are. And there's other things like weeds. That's quite a big threat. So two grasses, African lovegrass and buffelgrass. They're quite big, important weeds nationally, and they just overtake all of the native ground cover. They can increase fire frequency and severity, which they're adapted to, and they just outcompete after a fire as well. So not only do they burn hotter, they can come back quicker. So they open up sort of more space for themselves, and it threatens those big trees that we've got. We've got big old coolabah trees that they're massive, and they would have been standing here for 400 years or more. So losing things like that is quite a big threat and a big loss to the ecosystem. It provides homes and structure and things like that for animals. So other than that, that's sort of our big ones, but just figuring out how the ecosystem's working down there, how it's going to impact our current management. Yeah.
And I believe one of the valuable things of this particular property is that it gives you access to both banks as the Kookaburra enters the swamp, doesn't it? Which means that you don't have to have a boundary fence running right through the swamp, which constantly gets knocked down every year. Is that right?
Yeah,
It's
that's
a bit
right.
easier.
Yeah, so it's quite a pain, especially for Jack, getting in there to try and even figure out, has our fence been washed away? You can be cut off for, over a year. The soil's really like a big sponge, and if you go in there, you don't get out, sort of thing. And yet we sort of just have been dealing so far with a flood comes down, we can't fix the fence. We know that stock are going to come in, and then managing that sort of after the fact. But yeah, it's going to make our management so much easier because our boundary will now be mostly in that dry country.
And I believe that when there are big floods, you start moving around the property in canoes. Is that right? I think the previous reserve manager, Greg, used to do that, didn't he?
Yeah, we've heard sort of people that have lived here, for decades of taking their kids to the mailbox in a dinghy because there's been inches of water through the house. So yeah, it can get quite wet, and it's really quite special.
Wow. Well, it all sounds very exciting, and we've got some very helpful and interesting questions coming through, which we'll get to shortly. If there is anything we haven't covered yet, please do chuck your questions in the chat. Before we get to that, though, I would love to show a video of a chat I had with our CEO, Rachel Lowry. Normally I'd get her on to have a live chat, but we have our board meeting taking place today, so she's occupied looking ahead with the board, but she kindly spent some time last week to have a chat to review the year and to really give us a sense of what she's been most excited about as she completes her first year at the helm of Bush Heritage. And it's been quite a different year to previous years. People probably know we've had a run of wonderful acquisition opportunities, of which this one we think is the last for the year. But that's meant a different flavour. So here's Rachel telling us what it's been like for her.
We've all had a wonderful year, haven't we, with some great achievements. So let's talk about them. But first, you started with Bush Heritage almost a year ago now, didn't you? We've had quite a whirlwind. It's been a very different year to the previous years because we've had this huge number of acquisitions, haven't we? Evelyn Downs, then Sandstrom, then Dodgy Downs, and now possibly, well, not possibly, most likely Nil Desperandum. Perhaps you can talk a bit about that and some of the other highlights for Bush Heritage this year.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Look, there's no doubt that on the acquisition front, all that momentum that's been afoot that our supporters have just helped back in time and time again is a highlight in its own right, because it's generated a huge amount of hope and promise for impact. But we've got a strategy towards 2030 that's to deepen and double. And I think I almost worry at times that celebrating all of the acquisitions, which are so key and so fundamental to broadening our impact, has not always allowed for the bandwidth and the celebration of some of the wins on the deepening front. So if you're going to ask me for highlights, I'm going to go there because we've had a lot to celebrate this year on that front as well, from securing more reserves under special wildlife reserve status in Queensland, which is that gold-plated protection mechanism, from Edgbaston to the likelihood and promise of Carnarvon Reserve coming in under special wildlife reserve as well. We also had the Queensland government, after many efforts to engage them, withdraw their timber interests on Carnarvon Reserve. So again, that's another example of that promise to protect forever. I had a beautiful day just a month or so ago out in Belair Reserve in the Karakara Wedderburn out in Victoria with our partners at Jara. We launched the landscape scale right way plan called Wareka Gold Canoe, and that was just one of those days that it's one to remember because it was a celebration of a 17-year strong partnership with traditional custodians and a plan that's taken 4 years to co-write together, and a great example of that right way walking together that once that continued activation will lead to more impact. So that was a nice day. Some of the tech interventions, what do I call them, pilots that are coming through, I'm loving seeing that disruptive, let's see if we can do things a bit differently. We received a big grant from government, 1.65 million this year, to test and validate the use of AI in helping us manage cats, basically feral cats, across some of our reserves. That's exciting. I can't wait to see how that goes. And then from the use of satellite imaging and drone imaging to helping inform our habitat assessments and verify the quality of our wins. Look, I could go on. Landscape restoration, especially some of the natural capital partnerships and the scale of restoration we're seeing across the Fitzsterling in Western Australia. We've taken some big strides there this year, through to Scottsdale, where there's also been the volunteer force out at Scottsdale getting plants in the ground, and then seeing uplift in some of the maintenance of our buildings. Look, the deepening space is definitely moving as well, and that's off the back of the support of so many bushies, and it has been an incredible year.
Fantastic. Well, I know that great years aren't built entirely on good news. Have there been any significant challenges in your first year that you can share with us?
Look, for me personally, it's probably just that there's 1.4 million hectares of reserves out there that I'm busting to see, and I every time I get out on country with staff and with our partners, whether that's traditional custodians or agricultural partnerships,
Yes.
I leave a better CEO and more informed. And yet, you know, I've probably never had a time in my life where I've wished I had a time machine more, because there's also incredible major donors and supporters and people leaving us gifts in wills that nothing beats getting in front of our supporters and saying thank you and listening to their hopes and aspirations. And again, we get better every time we do that. So that's just been the challenge, but it's a great challenge to have. And I've managed to get out to many reserves and meet many of our supporters, but I'm mindful I've got more to do there. But for more broadly, across bush heritage, I can't ignore, or none of us can turn a blind eye to some of the impacts that are happening with climate change and already the now. We talk about the future, but, you know, it's been a year of fires and floods and that sort of intensity and the early onset within season, some of the drought in certain areas as well. We're very mindful and equally doing what we can to proactively get those climate ready plans in place, some of those disruptive, innovative interventions, being able to test those, and the climate modelling to inform, you know, the science around where we invest and how we invest in the future. But it's a challenging space for everyone, not just bush heritage.
No, that's fantastic. Well, you mentioned our supporters, and I know you've been attending and talking about our work to a lot of supporter events this year, which have gone down extremely well. Is there any particular message you'd like to send out at this particular point for our online supporters who are watching us? Because they're a wonderful bunch. Is there anything additional you'd like to share with them?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I just had a thought. You were talking about those supporter events. The last one I attended was just a few weeks ago in Adelaide, and I had one of our incredible supporters out there, Rob, reach out to me afterwards and said, I loved hearing about everything that's going on, but he gave some advice, and I think it's really timely, and it's something we'll work to better communicate. But you know, he mentioned it's great to talk about the impact you're having for biodiversity across bush heritage, and the impact sometimes it's cultural and it's social through the partnerships with that be through agricultural partnerships or partnerships with traditional owners. But protecting healthy country is climate action as well, and those nature-based solutions to climate change is something that I think bush heritage is very well poised to communicate and advocate for in a way that's inspiring and filled with hope. And there is so much of even some of the highlights I just ran through that are in their own right climate action. And I thought I would just mention that because, again, I walked away from that supporter event going, that's great advice, and we need to continue to ensure we message that in. And that leads me to the thanks. You know, thank you to everyone that continues to stand and back in the Healthy Country Protected Forever agenda. It's this momentum that we're achieving in what are quite difficult times, in a cost of living crisis, with more and more demands on a number of fronts. There's so many great and worthy causes out there for the Healthy Country Protected Forever call to action to be resonating with so many, and allowing us to have the confidence to take a conservation win like the acquisition of and management of Nil Desperandum out there is only because of the might and the effort that has come from our supporter base. So thank you sincerely for that.
That's wonderful to hear. And as you know, this webinar is all about the opportunity to purchase Nil Desperandum. I think you had a chance to get out there, didn't you, last week? I did. I was there a couple of weeks before that. Isn't it an amazing place? Can you tell us a bit about your experience of it? Because the photos and videos that are coming back are just magnificent. And obviously it's an important acquisition for us, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's allowing us to provide hope across so many different fronts with this story as well, because first of all, the need for connectivity is one we've seen through so many of the areas where we've focused our energy this year, whether it's been through Dodgy Downs or Sandstrom, Evelyn Downs, and now Nil Desperandum. They are all linking up existing efforts around land conservation to build on wins that are, you know, building on a legacy in the past, which is important in its own right. Being able to shine the spotlight on the Murray Darling Basin and some of the least disturbed parts of the Murray Darling Basin, and the fact that it's not too late to get in and draw a line in the sand and say, this patch doesn't need to fall as well. We don't need to accept modification and degradation here, is in itself quite powerful. The wetlands, I can see your picture. You've done a better job of capturing it than me, believe it or not. This picture I snapped at Nil Desperandum last week, but it's blown up just into the treetops. But you know, this connectivity that's not just about landscape, but around freshwater systems, which are so often overlooked and underprotected. I love that we're being given an opportunity to strengthen a conservation win there. Through to, the landscape-based wins, the black box coolabah ecology that's rare, through to, you know, over 200 species that will benefit from this acquisition and the expanded protection and connectivity. So I could go on. It's a beautiful, beautiful landscape, the sense of presence when you enter. I just feel really proud and fortunate to be in a position in an organisation at a time where we're being given the opportunity to expand on this footprint, and it feels very achievable. I'm hoping that once again people back us in.
Yes, fantastic. Well, it's always nice to reflect towards the end of the year on some of the highlights. And one particular element of that I always love is have you got a personal wildlife experience that has really got you excited, or, you know, made you tingle just because it's so wonderful to experience it?
I mean, getting to the job that I do, there've been many this year. It's just been incredible. I'm going to reflect back on Budjiti country when I was out there last week. Just coming out of Nil Desperandum and driving back into Nari, and I asked the team to stop the car, because I think those that live out there are just so used to seeing some of these scenes, and yet I was like, and I'm not drawing on the most threatened of species here, but it's an iconic species, and there was this mob of emus that were literally just passing through the landscape into an area that, you know, was really bordering between Nari and Nil Desperandum, and it was I had to get my camera out and just enjoy the moment, pull the car over and not just go, oh, that's just another mob of emus, because they were passing through a landscape that we're trying to acquire to prevent a big fence from getting put up, and who knows what would happen if it was to go on the open market. And I just, in that moment, I never want to take for granted that movement that landscape scale conservation management allows. And sure, it's easy to see because emus are quite large, but you know, it was just for me that moment of, this is what we're trying to achieve here, this movement, which is just so important. And they had chicks at foot, and it was just one of those moments where I just pinched myself and thought how fortunate I was to be there and to be doing this at this point in time.
How beautifully symbolic. That's a cracking story.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, to wrap things up, let's look forward. What about 2025? Are there some exciting things on the horizon?
Yeah, so many. I want to draw our attention back to that deepen promise again within our strategy, that deepen and double. Acquisitions are so important because they give us that footprint that we get to have that impact within in a more up sense, although equally our partnerships allow us to provide influence and support, which can't be, you know, taken for granted. But I'm confident that we're going to continue to see this momentum across both deepening and doubling, and we'll start to see some of the results of some of those tech-based interventions that I've mentioned, and I think that will also continue to challenge us to disrupt and think about how we can do things differently from a climate-ready lens. We will continue to see some of these partnerships around natural capital. I mean, yeah, sure, we acquired Dodgy Downs this year. Next year, we get to start developing that business case that starts to get plants in the ground. And that will be climate action as well. The scale of restoration, learning from Monjabat, learning from red mort, seeing those species start to return. I think it's all but one threatened species that we've managed in the last several years to, you talk about build it and they will come, entice back into that landscape. I'm looking forward to more of that, you know, hopefully more of that with Nil Desperandum. We'll get to really start to invest more in getting this landscape scale management happening in a place where it's needed most, and continuing to scan, you know, other opportunities around underrepresented, severely threatened, urgent landscapes that need our attention. So there's lots to look forward to, I'm certain of that.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining me today to record this segment. It's fantastic to hear some of the highlights of the year and to feel optimistic about the future. Look forward to talking again soon. Pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks, Rachel. Bye.
Bye, Matthew.
So that's a bit of a roundup of everyone's views on this amazing property. And as you've heard today, it's going to be a very important acquisition for us. We don't have it in the bag yet to answer one of the questions that came in. And of course, we do have a bit of a deadline. The settlement's scheduled for January the 30th, and our target is to raise 2.6 million by Christmas. We launched about 3 weeks ago, and so far, I think as of the beginning of this webinar, we're up to about 690,000 has been raised in a period of 3 weeks. So we're in the final push of the campaign. I can see that some of you online have already donated to the campaign, which is absolutely wonderful. If any of the other listeners are considering helping us, your gift would be hugely appreciated by the Bush Heritage team, not least Bridget and Jack, who are hoping to add this to the portfolio that they're looking after now. The really good news is that a couple of our incredibly generous supporters have offered to match any donations that come in by Christmas. So any donation made between now and Christmas will be doubled as a result of their gift. So if anybody would love to help us out with this project, you can make a donation via the website. The link will go into the chat now. You're very welcome to call us and speak to us. And there's even going to be a QR code up on the screen, which will reappear at the very end. If you're really keen to get in there quick, and the QR code will take you to our donations page. So that's the big ask for this webinar, and we also need to answer some of the questions that have been coming through, which I think will help people understand what's actually involved in this. Joe, I thought I'd throw this first suite of questions over to you. There's been a couple of questions about is this an outright ownership or is it leasehold? And linked to that, the other properties on the basin around about, what are they? Are some of them a conservation estate or are they all pastoral properties? Can you help us a bit with that, just to sort of paint the picture?
Yeah, sure. The property is a crown lease, like most of the properties in this area. So it's leasehold, as most rangelands inland Australia is. The other properties, there's a lot of small lots within this kind of landscape, and there's a number of owners who own multiple lots, mostly running small stock. Which is kind of key to that area. But there's also national parks in New South Wales have done a really tremendous job of they also see the value of this landscape and its importance. So they're also working to reconnect it. So they now own about, Bridget, correct me if I'm wrong, it might be about 70,000, maybe it's 35,000 hectares. Have I got the figures?
So I think they own about 70,000. Comaru or Kuttabara is about 37,000 and Brendan Gabba is about 33,000.
Yeah, so it's pretty extraordinary if you think of the combined conservation efforts and working with our pastoral neighbours as well. Within this landscape is really important. Did I answer all those questions, Matthew? Did I just leave one off? There was a few.
No, I think that's absolutely what I hope to reassure people that it's already got the national parks have done a big investment and bought up some properties that I know have been key to that. So we really do have a big corridor and a big area of landscape where we can work together with the conservation owners as well as the other pastoralists, many of whom are willing to share, predator control, feral control. Dealing with weeds as we always do in the landscape. So the bush heritage properties can act like an anchor, can't they, in the landscape and have an impact over a much broader space.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that I don't know if we mentioned, but this is a wetlands of real significance. And one of the things that Bush Heritage will do too, thinking kind of beyond the boundaries of this, is have it Ramsar listed. We'll work with government on that and really shine a light on this area and increase the protection kind of outside of the conservation estate as well.
And there was a link question, which was, are there any caveats or any mining exploration licenses and so forth? And I think Rachel talked about, in a different property, where the forestry rights were given up. What's the score with Nil Desperandum?
I'm not sure about the mining, if there's any tenements across. Bridget, I don't think there are there?
I
At
don't
the
believe there
moment,
are.
there's
I haven't seen any.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a really, it gives us greater impact, I guess, from a conservation perspective, when that's not the case. And being a wetland of such significance to protecting it from those types of threats is really important. The key threats that we'll be addressing are those feral animals, weeds, those types of impacts.
Yes, indeed. Some further questions about how we're going to deal with it once we actually get the property. It's a really lovely question. Would we consider changing the names of the properties to Indigenous names? And I think that speaks to an underlying policy we have, which we don't always talk about. Do you want to just talk about that, Joe, and how that plays out?
Yeah, no, we definitely do consider that. We consider multiple things when we're looking at this. So we'll work with the Budjiti traditional custodians on that, and that's generally driven by custodians, not by bush heritage. We've got a few precedents where we have done this, and Pilanga Reserve in Western Queensland is a really great example. Its pastoral name was Craven's Peak, and the Wonkamatala traditional custodians requested that it be changed to a traditional word that represents the spring, the really important spring in the area, which is Pilanga. And so Bush Heritage honoured that, and we changed it on title. So we definitely do that where it's appropriate. And it's a really lovely way to anchor that property in its enduring connection to custodians.
Yes, indeed. And another question that perhaps Bridget, you can answer. What's the infrastructure like on Nil Desperandum? We
Yeah,
had a
so
quick look the other.
yeah, there's not a lot, but there's sort of an old homestead and they're really old yards, and but there's a newer house that the current owners have sort of built themselves. It's quite nice. It looks over one of the dams where you get a lot of water birds coming in. There's a little open bore bar looking out over that too, and it's quite nice. There's otherwise a few fences that need to come down. There's not a lot, and then a few little watering points across the property.
Yes, we had a look at it, didn't we, when I was up there a few weeks back? And that open bore bath looks very nice to have a warm, salty bath at the end of a busy day. So that an interesting little extra benefit. There's a number of questions coming in on the animal side of things, which is always intriguing, which is we've talked about some of the mammals and birds and reptiles. What about the freshwater ecology? Can you talk to us about that? And a second question about bats, whether we're on the edge of the range of the little red flying fox and whether that might be one of the species that it's worth looking out for.
Yep. So I'll answer the fox one first. So there was a colony of little red flying fox on Naree when we purchased it. I haven't seen them since then, but we're definitely keeping our eyes out because, yeah, as in the question, we're within their range. It just depends, how good the rest of the habitat is, what they're doing elsewhere. But we hope to see them again sometime. And as for the freshwater species, we get a lot of crayfish. So yeah, like the traditional yabby, there's plenty of those. Carp is a really big issue in our waterways. They really stir up the water, make it really murky, and exclude a lot of other species. But some of the native things that we get in there are perch. We get little sort of shrimp things called macrobrachium. I've probably said that wrong, so I apologise to any freshwater ecologist watching. We get little eel-tail catfish. But things we're hoping to see would be Murray cod. That would be amazing. There's places where we get a really invasive fish called, the name has just escaped me, but the ones on Edgbaston, they're really bad. Gambusia, yeah. So we get Gambusia and they outcompete and they're really aggressive and they can be quite damaging as well. But we get these little beautiful fish called desert rainbow fish. Dean was here a few years ago and we found some of those, and that was really lovely. But we really need to do a lot more in that space too.
Fantastic. There's some further questions about what will happen if we can't purchase the property. You probably saw a response from our head of philanthropy, Claudia, in the chat about the fundraising effort. We're reasonably confident, based on the wonderful support we've received previously this year for other properties, that we will get to that target. But of course, you can't rely on it. So we are doing a big social media and direct mail campaign at the moment to support us, and some advertising. So we do hope to achieve that. If we don't do it, the options are to not acquire it, and in which case it would probably be acquired by a pastoralist, to answer that particular question. And they would probably knock over a few mulga trees here and there to feed the goats if they're goat people, and there are some as neighbours. I know there's one guy who actively farms goats, isn't there, as a near neighbour to Nari. But if we get close to our target, we do have the benefit of a capital fund whose purpose is to help us across the line occasionally if we're not able to reach the fundraising target. We don't like to do that, of course, because capital funds are there for emergencies and to help facilitate things. And if we draw down from that, we don't have it available, that amount, for the next big project that comes up. But I think everybody's quietly confident that we will hit the target. And hopefully we will have this reserve purchased by the end of January. Linked to that question, there's a question about why have there been so many wonderful acquisitions in the past 12 months, and can we hope it will continue? Now, that's $1 million question, I think. I think it's been just chance, and the opportunities have come up that have been the right opportunities. Joe, you're involved in those decisions, I know, at the senior leadership team level. Can you perhaps answer that more broadly, that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's our strategy and our supporters really driving it, Matthew. I think we're really working with government has recognised, and internationally we've recognised, that the best chances from a climate perspective, from a conservation perspective, are try to hit the 30 by 30 target, and that is 30% of land, 30% of marine area protected by 2030. And Bush Heritage recognised that we play an important role. The private sector plays a really important role in this. And so we're working hard at acquisitions. Obviously, timing is the essence. So when properties come up, ensuring they're within our priority landscapes, ensuring that we actually can afford to do it and then afford to manage them and get really great conservation outcomes is important, which is why we work with government to try and connect to national parks and other estate where we can and make a big impact. And we still have a fair way to go. We said we would double the amount of area under conservation estate by 2030 that Bush Heritage owns and manages. Still got a way to go. It's a really key focus for me as head of region in the north, and I'm looking for big areas of land that we can make big impact on. And our supporters have been incredibly generous and really fueling us and enabling us to do this.
Thanks, Joe. There's a really lovely question here about are there any challenges in providing the researchers and ecologists and land managers on the ground to actually look after properties as we acquire them? And it's a very valid point. And I know if we look back to when I started with Bush Heritage 7, 8, 9 years ago, ecologists were thinly spread over the landscape, I think, weren't they, Joe? And in the meantime, because we've had a few years where we haven't purchased properties, we have been able to increase our staffing across the country. And I think we have an ecologist in place in every priority landscape and for every suite of reserves, don't we now, Joe?
Yeah, that's right. We have invested. I mean, the key thing holding it back always is money, connections. We recognize that we can't do all the work. So we have really strong relationships with universities, research groups, because this is key to what we do, is really understanding the ecology of each area and and we are investing in that. It's also when we look at a property like Nil Desperandum or any property that Bush Heritage acquires, that we don't just think the acquisition price. We say, well, what will this actually cost to manage it and manage it well for conservation in the longer term? So we look at that, all the ecology that goes into it, as well as the land management, the covenanting to get strong protection, the management, everything. So that has to be key to what we do, because good science is essential and it needs money.
Absolutely. And Bridget's rather cheeky response to that question in the back channels here, which she didn't expect me to say, is that there's absolutely no limit to how much money ecologists and researchers can spend, which we know, because we all have ambitions that are huge. And there is some amazing work going on the ground. Well, listen, we've got to just past 1 o'clock. There were a few other questions in there. We may not have the chance to get to all of them. One final one. Have cane toads reached Nari, Bridget?
No, luckily we're cane toad free. Just frogs here.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's a good thing. Well, as we're running out of time, I think we better close off the Q&A. We will get in touch with anybody whose questions we haven't been able to answer via email after this, because we do like to make sure we get back to everybody. Hope you've enjoyed hearing about this wonderful property, Nil Desperandum. You may have heard Ross describe it as Nildo. We've all been training ourselves not to say Nildo. But hopefully we can show a picture of what the letterbox looks like at the entrance to the Nil Desperandum Reserve, which those Latin scholars amongst you will know means do not despair. And here's my colleague Patrick on a recent trip at the letterbox, which that glorious make do with what you've got in the bush is an old fridge. But we will be referring to this Nil Desperandum and hopefully renaming it as soon as we can acquire it. If you would like to support the acquisition, as I mentioned earlier, please get in touch with us. You can donate on the website or please contact our supporter care team. Before we sign off, I'd just like to offer a thanks from all the Bush Heritage staff to this wonderful bunch of caring and generous supporters who keep us going and keep us in jobs and keep the great work going on the ground across the country as we make sure that we can keep doing healthy country that's protected forever. So thank you. Thank you for joining the webinars. Thank you for coming to events this year. And thanks for supporting our ambitions to continue to grow and to continue to deepen and double. And Joe and Bridget, thanks for joining us and spending some time with us today. It's been great to chat. And we look forward to sharing some more stories with you in 2025. I hope everybody has a wonderful, safe and happy holiday season and look forward to chatting more in the new year. Thanks, folks. Please stick around for the closing video. As always, there'll be some lovely images. And thanks, Joe. Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks.
Thank you.